All right, here we go. We are going to do our last lecture before the test, and that is on ecology and specifically the ecosystems and the energy that flows in those ecosystems. So, in order to talk about that, let me take you through first a review. Remember that we've talked already about an individual, that's an organism, that creates a group of individuals, which is a population. And in population ecology, it's basically a same species living together or a herd. We also then have a community of populations. So that one population joins other populations, and together they make a community. And in the last several weeks, we've talked about these two things, populations and communities, and we've talked about very specific things. Today, we're going to go ahead and talk about ecosystems, and we're going to be talking about how those ecosystems are organized and how the components of an ecosystem flow through it or create the energy to maintain that ecosystem. Before we go any further, though, what I'd like to go ahead and do is talk to you about factors that affect populations, because it seems that there's been some confusion about it. And in order to talk about that, I want to remind you that within a population, there are factors that affect that population. And these factors are density dependent factors or density independent factors. So the fact that you have to be in a population, and if there's a high density of people, a lot of organisms in an area, then things that keep that population alive or things that limit that population is going to become a density dependent factor. So predation is an excellent example of a density dependent factor. Another example would be a density independent factor. And in this case, something like drought, something that we can't necessarily control, right? These are factors that are outside of the control of the population or herd that will affect their population numbers. So you have a density dependent factor and then a density independent factor. So independent of the population and dependent on the population. That's how those two things work. All right. Then in communities, we talked about the different relations in a community.
With so many organisms living on Earth.
There you go. For example, that it's any relationship where two species, so these could be different species, like the bear and the cow in this picture, and those species can survive in different ways. Mutualism is where they both benefit. Commensalism is where one benefit and one is like, and the other one is parasitism, and that's really bad. So then we also have the ecosystems. That's where we're going to be talking about next. Ecosystems are things like a bunch of communities together, and within those communities, how they interact and how the energy flows between them. So an ecosystem is where we have all of the organisms in the community plus the abiotic factors. And so, hey, stop it. My dog was eating my carpet. I'm sorry, guys. Ecosystems are basically transformers of energy. So they will process the matter. So like any of the chemicals, they're processing it in there. All ecosystems are self-sustaining. So until you start putting something else in its place or messing around with the factors inside the ecosystem, most of them will be self-sustaining. And that's because sunlight is the ultimate source of that energy in the ecosystem. And so when you look at that ecosystem, the main energy source is from producers. So we talked about photosynthesis and how sun is taking its energy and hitting the plants, and the plants, through the use of chlorophyll, transfer that energy into carbohydrates or sugar. And so all of that energy starts off with the producer and then is transferred to the consumer, or it will be decomposed. So you can see that in the brown or blue arrows here in this chart, where the energy is flowing from the producers into all the different types of consumers and decomposers. So let's take a look now at what some of the roles are of these organisms you see, producers and consumers and decomposers. So autotroph, or a producer, is what we consider to be an organism that uses energy from its environment to make their own food. The definition of photosynthesis. So plants, some bacteria, and some organisms called protists are considered to be producers. Now, heterotrophs are those organisms that rely on other organisms for food and energy. We call them heterotrophs. We've reviewed that term once before. Or in this case of what we're talking about now, we're talking about consumers. So in the animations there, you're seeing one type of consumer, and the bottom you're seeing another type of consumer. Now let's talk about the different kinds of consumers, because they are different. So here we have two very cute and adorable little consumers. These specific consumers are ones that we call herbivores. Herbivores are basically organisms that are only eating plants. So like a vegetarian, basically, is an herbivore. They're only eating plants. So different types of animals that you may know of that make themselves are herbivores are cows, deers. Insects, surprisingly, except for those that bite us, are considered animals that only eat plants. And then even some birds will only eat plants. So now we have this great looking picture, and a guess on what we're going to talk about here? Carnivores, okay? Organisms that only eat meat. Humans are not carnivores. We cannot survive with only meat. Oh my gosh, our bodies would just break down and die if we only ate meat. We know carnivores as lions, tigers. We can't say bears. Bears are not carnivores, but wolves are carnivores. So omnivores are what we call bears. So these are organisms that eat plants and meat like humans, bears. And then there's also some birds who will eat both plants and animals. So the magpie is an example. The cockroach is an insect that is an omnivore. It'll eat other insects, or it'll also eat plants. All right, so now what the last kind of role that we have is going to be a detritivore, or a scavenger. This is basically the type of organisms that eat dead things. So in this case, a scavenger is an organism that eats dead remains. In some cases, those remains are going to be animal remains, like vultures and coyotes. Worms would be a scavenger, but they or a detritivore, but they're eating dirt, plant material, not necessarily meat material, unless they're a maggot. Decomposers are also the others that are going to eat organic matter and return those nutrients to the soil. And those are like mushrooms and bacteria. So here is a bunch of scavengers eating a dead animal on what looks like to be a beach. And then over here, we have mushrooms, which are decomposers. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to figure out how to put all of those things together into an organized line, like you saw way back in the intro. And when we do that, we call this a food chain. Now, what's important to note here is that this is a pathway which food is transferred, and not food. It's not like the grass is giving the food to the grasshopper, but the grass is giving the energy to the grasshopper. Okay, so we break food chains into different levels called trophic levels. Trophic levels are divisions that we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. Producers are one of those levels. Consumers are the other part of that level. And so because there's different consumers that eat different types of things, we have different levels of them: primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then of course decomposers, because they all have to break everything down and put it back into the environment. So here is a couple of examples of some food chains. Notice that they're very singular. They're one direction: plant to herbivore to carnivore to carnivore to carnivore. Okay, plant from the ocean into an animal in the ocean, into another carnivore, another carnivore, another carnivore. Okay, these are all chains. They are very singular. You can't branch off, just one direction. This is different from a food web. A food web is where we take a whole bunch of chains within an environment and put them together to show relationships. So what we have is basically all the food chains being linked together in an ecosystem. So here's an example of a food chain for land. The plants are getting eaten by multiple things, which are getting eaten by multiple things, which are getting eaten by the higher level consumers: foxes, owls, and snakes. So what's the main difference? A food web is basically a whole bunch of interactions that link a whole bunch of food chains together, whereas a food chain is just singular. All right, so specific trophic levels. So this is each step in a chain or a web. The first level is going to be your producer. Your second level is going to be your primary consumer, and the primary consumer is typically the herbivore. Omnivores can also be a secondary level depending on if there are no herbivores in the environment. The third level is your secondary consumers, which are your omnivores or your carnivores. And then your fourth level, or your tertiary consumer, is going to be typically your carnivores, your scavengers, or in some cases your decomposers. What we do then is we take these and we put them into a pyramid together. And so plants, the producers, since they're the ones who have to get the sun, we have to put those producers to get on the bottom because they contain all the energy from the sun. And then that energy is transferred to the herbivores because they're what are eating the plants. And then that energy is transferred to the omnivores, who are eating both plants and other herbivores. And then the carnivores are at the top of that pyramid because they are only eating the omnivores or herbivores. They don't eat plants at all. We call the top three levels consumers and the bottom level a producer. So in summary, remember the sun is transferring the energy to the bushes. The deer is receiving the energy from the bushes by eating them. And the wolf is getting the energy from the deer by eating it. Where did the source of this energy come from? The sun. So what we do is we can take a pyramid, a food pyramid, and transfer it into something called an energy pyramid. And an energy pyramid is very special because it takes the total amount of any living thing present in any of the levels, and it looks at the amount of energy that is available. So, for example, most of the energy levels, or most of the energy in a level, is going to be lost, and I'll show you where that gets lost to in a minute. I'm going to tell you, I'll show you in a picture as well. Activities from that organism, heat that they give off, the chemical reactions that are going on, all of those are being lost in a trophic level. So the sun puts its energy in, the plants use some of that energy to go into photosynthesis and to help build more plant leaves, to build flowers, to help grow its roots. We cannot take the energy that the plants are using to grow and sustain themselves and pass those on. That energy has been used up. But 10% of the energy, roughly, that is taken from the sun is then pushed on to the next level. That therefore 90% is lost. And this is why most food chains are going to have 5 or less links. That's because by the time you get on the top, that top animal has to eat so many animals from the bottom level or the level below it that it can barely survive. So here's an example of an energy pyramid where only 10% of the energy is available to the next level. We're just going to say the rest is lost as heat. Okay, that heat is in the form of a chemical reaction, in the output of energy to make itself, all of that let's just call heat. Okay, and so at the bottom you see that these primary producers are getting about 200 kilocalories, and the only thing that a kangaroo is going to get by eating those animals is about 20 kilocalories. And so if the coyote at the top eats the kangaroo, they're getting only 2 kilocalories per kangaroo. So not a lot. So in order for that wolf to sustain itself, it has to eat a lot of kangaroos, just like the kangaroo has to eat a lot of plants in order to sustain itself. So here's another very simple, right, component of what's happening here. Okay, 100% at the bottom, 0.01 for the apex predator. Okay. So here's another visual, right? So that bug is eating the leaf, and 57% of the energy is going to waste. 33% is being used in cellular respiration, and then 10% is being used in growth. And so that 10% could then be passed on from or onto the next level, whatever eats that bug. Okay, so this video here is meant to be a video to help you understand how pollution affects animals in a food chain. So it's called biomagnification. And part of the reason why there are signs posted along the bay in San Francisco and along certain rivers, don't eat the fish here, is because of this concept called biomagnification. This is basically saying that if the little things, the plants are eating all of the contaminants, then you're going to get those contaminants magnified at as a top level consumer. And then this is an example of what happens to an animal who is the top level consumer and what happens to their reproductive tissues once they have been contaminated. All right. Well, your activity for this week is to do another gizmo. This gizmo is going to look at food webs and food chains. We're going to do it a little differently. I've put together a Google form, and I'd like you to put all the answers in the Google form to help me grade it a little faster, because we are getting to the end of the year, and I'd like to have some time to get those graded, because I'm already behind. All right. Well, I hope that this has been helpful, and we will talk to you again live soon.